Welcome back to the Road to 2000. As always, my name is Caleb, and I will be your driver for tonight's lesson. So what I talked about last week was in kind of an introduction to closed structures in chess. And what I went through that week was basically the King's Indian structure. So that's with white pawns on d5, e4, and c4, and black pawns on c7, d6, and e5. Those kind of structures. And so today I want to kind of relate them to a different type of closed structure that shows up quite often in chess, and that's the kind of advanced French or advanced Caro-Kann pawn structure. So what that means is basically what you see right here on the board. White has these pawns on d4 and e5, and black has these pawns on e6 and d5, and that's kind of the core of the structure. The center is closed because these two pawns, or these four pawns rather, don't really move around all that often. And so based on what we learned last week, the principles of play on the side where you have more space. So for white, that would be the king side. And for black, that would be the queen side. What do you think the plans are? What are the pawn breaks going to be for both sides? So yeah, where does white play? I already told you the king side, right? So what type of moves is white going to be playing? What type of pawn breaks with these three pawns?
F4, F5.
Yeah, so very often f5 is going to be a pawn break. Usually you start with something like g4. And what pawn breaks is black going to be playing?
C5.
Yeah, so c5, attack this backward pawn on d4. Not a backwards pawn, but the base of the pawn chain. And then something I want to touch on a little bit later in today's lecture is a different sort of idea of playing these positions. So the classical way that I was talking about last time, which works almost all the time in the King's Indian, is to attack the base of the pawn chain on the side where you have more space. But in specifically the French Tarrasch, black actually picks a different approach to attacking this type of pawn chain. So what happens in the French Tarrasch, or what is the other idea for black in this kind of structure? Any idea?
You could attack the head of the pawn chain.
Yeah, so you can actually attack this head of the pawn chain. But very often this turns out to be a lot more dangerous, because it you're playing on the side where you have less space, right? So you can run into certain attacks, certain tactics, and it's very easy to go wrong. Which is why when it is played, it's usually played only in very specific circumstances. It's far more common to see the c5 idea and black looking for counterplay on the queen side. Right now, this doesn't look like a Caro structure because our pawn's on c7, but just to show how we could transpose, something like c5 eventually gets played in both openings very often, c3, c takes d, c takes d. And this is kind of a natural continuation of the pawn structure. And still, black's going to be looking for play on this queen side, maybe on this c file, and maybe with these two pawns as well, gaining some more space with a6 and b5, and sometimes b4 as well. With that being said, let's jump into the first game here. So in this game, I had black, and I was playing against 1900. And this game happened actually quite recently. I believe it was at, I think I played this at Pan Am's. I'm actually kind of misremembering now. But we can see the game started with e4. I play the Caro-Kann, c6, d4, d5, and e5.
That was classical time control?
Yeah, it was a classical time control. This was, yeah. Wherever it was played, all I know is it was definitely classical. And so we've almost achieved the structure we just looked at, right? So the structure would happen after something like e6. But black isn't going to want to play this right away. Do you know why? No? Well, actually, the idea of the Caro-Kann, as opposed to the French, because this structure could be reached via this move order. This would be the advanced French, which we might take a look at. The idea with delaying this is you can develop this bishop. Because very often in the French, the bishop gets stuck behind the pawns. So we're going to develop the bishop to f5. Black has one other option there, but we're going to focus on this for today. So now that the bishop is developed, this bishop can be a strength because it's more active, but it can also kind of be a detriment to black's position. And what do you think the reason for that might be after something like, I don't know, knight f3, well, okay, let's say knight c3 and e6. What's an interesting idea for white here that you guys might have seen before? And I've actually taught a lecture on this opening line before.
Was it Shirov or someone who's, or Nigel Short actually played G4?
Yeah, it's the Shirov attack.
Oh.
And so white tries to say, okay, you've developed this bishop, but I can actually make it work in my favor. So what did we just say that white's plan often is in these structures? What is? Yeah, attack on the king's side. And what pawn break is white trying to play for?
The F5.
Yeah, white would like to play this F4, F5 pawn break. So because of that, very often, well, not as often, because it is risky to move your pawns this far in the opening, we sometimes see this G4 move. And then usually not in this position, but later on, white tries to play F4, F5 and gain more than one tempo on this bishop, actually. So we'll see this idea of the bishop getting kicked around in later games, maybe. But in this game, my opponent actually played a pretty weak line against the Caro. He actually just played bishop to d3. And so because sometimes this bishop becomes awkward, I'm going to say that this is kind of the first inaccuracy of the game. White kind of misunderstands that, okay, this bishop's outside the pawn chain, but it advances my plan in a lot of cases. So I shouldn't, do anything about it just yet. Whereas here, you're trading off, maybe white's good bishop, and you're just getting rid of this hook that you have to attack, to advance your plans. So I'd say this is a pretty significant mistake, actually. So I captured the bishop, he captured with the queen, and I went ahead and played e6. We see f4 right away. This move is also a bit strange. It's a nice idea to try to get this pawn break through right away, but it is also coming with some disadvantages as well. Why might white not want to play f4 right away? Any ideas?
Underdeveloped.
Well, yeah, he's underdeveloped, but it's not as though I'm going to launch some attack on his king, right? That's usually the problem when you're underdeveloped, is your king gets attacked or some weakness gets attacked right away and you can't really defend. Whereas that's not really going to happen here, because if you notice, I'm not exactly ahead in development, right? So there are other problems with f4 besides delaying development.
Blocks in the black bishop.
Yeah, one thing is it kind of blocks in this bishop, and not very often in this opening does the bishop come all the way out here or to f4. But it'd be nice to have this diagonal open for the bishop still. And there's one last thing that I want to mention about f4. Yeah?
I mean, maybe it's not that big, but I mean, the knight can go to h6, maybe.
Yeah, so I mean, it does block off this, so the knight, in theory, can go to h6.
Which is another, I guess, anyway.
Yeah, so the knight can come to h6, which is just another route it can take to get to f5, which is an important square. So those are all good points, but the last thing I want to mention is it actually weakens white's king, right? So what do I mean when I say that? I don't mean that right away I have queen h4 check, and after g3 and queen g4, I'm launching an attack on white, because I just don't have the pieces developed to back that up, right? So this would all be nonsense. But we'll see as the game goes on how this f4 move kind of comes back to haunt white, because it really does weaken a lot of squares around the white king, no matter where the white king decides to go. If he tries to castle later on, this diagonal is going to be a lot weaker now that the pawn's on f4. And later on in the game, this is also actually a common thing that happens, is f4 really weakens the second rank. Right? You have this pawn on f4, on f2, and it helps defend your king. Right? You can play things like g3 and king g2 later on, and you have this f2 pawn for shelter from any pieces on the second rank. But with the pawn on f4, none of that really exists, and the white king actually runs into a lot of trouble a lot of times in a lot of different endgames. So for all of those reasons, f4 isn't actually a great move. It's trying to, it's got the right heart behind it. It's trying to follow through with this pawn break. But you do have to pay attention and notice when you play things that weaken your king side like this. So what do you think? Well, I'll just play the move. I played queen b6. I think this has actually never been played before, but it's kind of a simple idea. I'm just putting pressure here, and I'm putting pressure here, so it might be difficult for white to get developed. We see c3 played, defending his d-pawn. I went ahead and played c5. knight f3.
Was there any difference to playing c5 before queen b6?
I just thought it might be, white might have this extra option because now I'm not attacking b2. But probably white wouldn't want to go in for something like this anyways, if I had to guess. He'd much rather have, I think, a pawn on d4. I might be wrong on this, because there are a lot of situations when white takes on d4 with the bishop, but if there is a meaningful difference, I'd say this is kind of it. I didn't have to think about any of this, because I played queen b6 first. So queen b6, c3, c5, knight f3. I captured here. He captured with the pawn. I went ahead and played knight c6. a3 was played. This move is actually just aimed at preventing stuff like knight b4 from, kind of invading white's camp while he's underdeveloped on the queen side. I went ahead and continued developing using this idea of knight h6. Knight to c3 was played, also developing the pieces. Knight to f5. The pawn was attacked, so white decided to defend it with knight to e2. And now, what move do you think black should play here? This one's rather important. Well, what would white like to do? Yeah, white would like to, see maybe. Okay, so I played bishop e7, but h5 was also the other idea that I wanted to talk about, because if you do nothing, if you play like a6, white's going to try to roll over you with this g4 and f5 pawn break, right? So black has to do something about this. So in the game, I played this move bishop e7, and so now what would the idea be after g4? Yeah, I would have this interesting move, knight h4. And the point is, white doesn't really have time to play something like f5 here, because I can take this knight and take this pawn. And if white doesn't play f5 right away, if he does something like castles, we'll say, so this stops the threat by allowing him to defend here, then I have another interesting move here. And what should black play? Otherwise, black's going to be in a bit of trouble. Black has to do something kind of immediate.
F5?
Certainly not f5. F5 weakens too many things. If we play f5 right away, he's going to take on passant, probably. We might take with the bishop. And this qualifies as interesting because you're trying to pile up here, but you've weakened all of these squares, right? And that's going to come back to haunt you maybe after, we'll say knight h4, bishop h4, even g5 here, and this bishop's getting kind of trapped. And this pawn's going to be a weakness. It's not my favorite thing. What else can black try? Aimed at preventing this f5 break from smashing through.
Well, I don't like it, but g6, I guess.
Yeah, g6 does try to prevent it. One problem is it's kind of stranding this knight for a long time.
You should trade knights first for anything else.
I mean, you can trade knights before anything else, but that doesn't really solve your problems, right? It just delays it for a move.
Oh, you can play h5.
Yeah, h5. And this presents white with actually quite a few problems. Black hasn't castled yet, so he would actually love to open this h-file. And a huge positional blunder for white would be to play this g5 move. So why would it be a huge positional blunder? It shouldn't be too difficult to tell.
And blockade is play on the king side.
Exactly, right? I don't know if knight f5 right away works, because maybe white has some interesting pawn sacrifice. I feel like this should be nothing for white, though. And if white doesn't try something like that, something like, if he plays like b4, I'll just play g6 next turn. And then there's absolutely nothing white can do to achieve a meaningful pawn break. And so that means there's no way for him to open up the position and no way for him to use his extra space. And black will simply have easy play on the queen side. So maybe white can try something like h3. And then after takes. But like I said, black's happy to have this open file for his rook. And I think this shouldn't be too dangerous. I'm trying to think what we might see after this. Any ideas?
Wondering about castling queenside, king b8.
Yeah, castling queenside isn't. Yeah, you're right, but it's not the most natural thing to do. But it makes a lot of sense here, actually. You can also probably play g6 here as well. Maybe after throwing in takes on f3. So something like this g6 with the idea of getting play on the king side actually. While this kind of goes against the idea, white has more space on the king side, but here actually white has also made a lot of weaknesses on the king side, right? And I'm also kind of now noticing a huge problem with f5 for white in the line I specified, which is this pawn would hang due to a pin.
That's what I was trying to take advantage of with playing earlier, with taking the knight early.
Yeah.
Away. Then if your pushes, you have the free pawn.
Yeah, that's a good point. But like all these ideas make just as much sense if white doesn't castle into this pin and plays something like I'm not sure what else white would play.
Rook f1, I guess.
Yeah, rook f1, maybe actually bishop e3 after takes, but yeah, I don't know. Like giving up this b pawn is an idea, so I'm trying to find some clever way to defend my pawn here, but maybe rook f1 is actually just the best way to do it. But regardless, the point of all this was, you always have to have some idea against this g4 f5 pawn break as black. Which here it's a bit more complicated than the other move, which is simply h5 that was suggested to stop g4. But it's just important that you have an idea to prevent white from just rolling over your position right away. So we saw bishop e7, castles, perhaps now with the idea of playing g4. So here I went ahead and played h5. And now, who do you think is better here, if anybody? Yeah, that's what I would say. It's not a huge advantage, right? Because black hasn't won any material. Black hasn't created any devastating weaknesses that white's gonna have to deal with. But white's actually just caused a lot of annoying problems for himself, right? He's put this pawn on f4, which is kind of weakening this diagonal. It's kind of weakening this rank. It's kind of weakening this king. He's left himself with this backwards b2 pawn, which maybe he'll push it to b4, but maybe that actually creates other weaknesses. He has this awkward pawn on d4 that he's always having to babysit. And he has no real plan. That's the huge thing. He has no plan to activate his pieces. And because of that, I'd much rather play black here. I wouldn't say black is winning yet because, black, like I said, hasn't won anything material-wise, and he's not really making any huge threats. But it's just much easier to move black's pieces around. So with that said, we said, black does have a clear plan. So what would that be from black's point of view? How does black actually advance? We might start by, we might start by completing development here, but I'll ask you from this position.
The rook on the c file, knight a5, knight c4.
Yeah, that's exactly right. You simply want to improve your pieces. We mentioned earlier when we were talking about just the pawn structure that the big pawn break was c5 and then taking on d4 usually, which since black has already achieved that, he simply wants to activate his pieces. So in my opinion, the best way to do that is to, like you mentioned, put rooks on the c file and try to improve this knight somehow by maybe coming to c4, maybe eyeing b3, and just go from there. So let's see what happened in the game. Sorry, I'm trying to turn up the brightness here. In the game, I went ahead and played rook c8, as you mentioned. It might be more natural to go with this rook, but in my head, I was thinking maybe this rook is going to be useful here somehow because there's some ideas of playing f6 in some positions. I don't know how true that is, but that's what I was thinking at the time. And I also thought maybe if white ever does get these pawn breaks in, I'd like to have a rook on the f file. Looking back, I think it makes just as much sense to come with the other rook, maybe more sense, but I don't know. I don't think it's a huge difference. So rook a8, knight g3. So this is something I see a lot of players fall back on, which is they can't find a clear plan, so what they do instead is just start trading pieces for the sake of trading pieces. And instead of this, what do you think white should have done to try to save this game? He can't find a clear plan on the king's side, but he can do something else. Yeah, so that's exactly right. So a lot of times in chess, it's not so easy to find a good way to advance your plan. And when that's the case, and sometimes even when you do have a clear way to advance, the best thing to do is actually prevent your opponent's ideas. So my ideas are to just double up on this c file and improve my knight, right? So because of that, you can look at moves like rook f to c1 for white. And this is kind of giving up on this f4, f5 idea. But this is actually one of the best ways for white to try to defend, in my opinion. The move that was mentioned was b4, which this is another good idea. But this is a highly committal move. Now, why would I say that? Yeah, it's allowing a future pawn break. Maybe this pawn break isn't. Yeah, maybe this pawn break isn't great right now because white has this b5 move. But later on down the line, this is always going to be something you have to worry about. So I would definitely, consider these moves like rook to c1 or b4. I think this is the best way for white to continue here, is simply accepting, okay, I don't have any advantage. There's no way for me to break through on the king's side right now. Maybe I'll just, switch to the queen's side and try to hold off, on my opponent's plan. We see knight g3 instead, which really, like I said, is kind of just trading pieces for the sake of trading pieces. I went ahead and captured because I don't want to let him ruin my pawn structure. He takes with the bishop. And now I play g6. Again, it's important to always make sure that your opponent's pawn breaks aren't going to come through. And now we see finally this b4 move that was mentioned. So he was worried about knight to a5 to c4, so we chose to stop it with b4, which makes sense to me. I go ahead and play rook c7. He plays rook to d1. I play rook f to c8. And now is kind of the only moment in the game my opponent had a chance to try to fight back. So what was I maybe not giving enough credit by just simply doubling on this c file? Yeah, that's right. So this f5 pawn break, anyways, can actually be very problematic for me here.
I don't know if I believe in this idea, but I guess it's some sort of counterplay.
Yeah, so the point is, how would black like to take this pawn back? Would he rather play g takes f or e takes f in a perfect world? Yeah. So he'd rather play e takes f. But now, after e6, I've actually trapped my own rook by playing rook to c8. And so there's nothing I can really do about this here. So this would force me to play g takes f. And then white actually has quite a lot of counterplay here that I didn't really account for in the game. I'm not entirely sure how the line might start. But this was kind of the point of putting this rook on d1, is it gives these pieces a little bit more freedom to move around. Yeah, so you might start with queen e3, you might start with bishop h4, but either way, white can actually start mounting an attack here. Let's say bishop h4, and already I'm not sure what I want to do with my pieces here.
Take on e5.
Yeah, the hanging pawn once takes back with the knight.
That doesn't quite work, right?
Why?
So if takes and takes on e5, unfortunately there's this fork. So yeah. So maybe actually just something like.
Oh, there's h3 though. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Never mind.
What am I missing something?
Oh, he was gonna ask about knight g4 after queen g3. And then
Yeah, it's just pinned with h3.
Right, yeah. So yeah, I think something like king h7 or king h8 would make the most sense for me. just to try to reorganize my pieces. Maybe it's really tough to decide between these two squares. Let's say takes and then h7, so I'm not allowing knight g5. And already you can kind of see maybe rook f3 isn't great right away. Maybe there's like knight f5 ideas, but white has quite a bit of counterplay here. And this was kind of my opponent's only chance to try to break through like this. So because of that, what do you think a better move would be here?
e7 to f5 to further blockade this.
Yeah, so that's one idea actually, is you can try to play something like bishop to d8. It looks a little awkward. One reordering of the pieces that I might have considered is rook to e8 here. And so now the point is, yeah, if you play something like this, we can maybe drop back to f8. And now, you know, I'm not sure how we might continue. Something like this. And, well, now that the bishop isn't on g3 anymore, I might go ahead and play here. See something like g4, takes, and knight e7. So we're stopping this, and we're getting our pieces in. This is kind of one way I might have reordered the pieces, which it's kind of clunky and kind of slow. But fortunately, our opponent has wasted so much time that we are kind of breaking through first here, which you can kind of see.
Why did he put his rook on d1 again, not c1?
It allows his queen to move away from defending the pawn.
So yeah, his idea with rook d1 is, it actually kind of makes some sense. And some of these lines now, especially after rook to c8, it gives this piece freedom to move. It adds another defender to d4, which is kind of what allowed those bishop h4, knight h4 ideas. Yeah, which I don't know if he actually saw that in the game, though, because he didn't play f5 here. But he kind of wanted to give his pieces more mobility, is what I would say. So instead of that, we saw bishop h4. And after bishop takes h4, knight takes h4, I simply played knight e7. And now there's really no way for white to get this f5 breakthrough anymore. Because my knight's here, it's defending this f5 square. And you know, like I said, anything white tries is going to be way too slow, because I'm already breaking through on this c file. So now I think it's already too late for white. I don't think there's any way for him to really save this position. And now you can really see, though, why white would have liked to be on the c file. Because with my rooks just completely dominating uncontested, there's really no chance for white to get back into this game. In the game, we saw him try rook to f3. Maybe he's trying to play rook g3 with some you know, sacrificial ideas. I simply played a5. Now I decided it was the appropriate moment for this breakthrough. Like I said, b4 was committal. It always gives black these options of playing this a5 move and trying to break it down. This ran into b5. When now I simply play rook to c1. I had a couple options here. Rook to c4 would have been a good move. Rook to c2 would have been a fine move. Even rook to c3. Probably rook c3 is bad, actually, because white would just take it. But, you know, plenty of options. Rook c1 was what I chose, threatening to capture and then capture. Because of this, white just plays rook to g3, I guess, hoping that you know, his counterplay on the king side is enough. But obviously, you know, it's just way too slow. I take on d1, he takes on d1, I take on b5. He plays h3 here, hoping to give his king some shelter. But like I said, now this f4 pawn actually comes into play, because without this pawn on f2, his king is still going to be far too weak, even if it hides on the h2 square. And we see that come into play pretty soon. So I just bring my pieces in closer. Queen b2 is very natural. Something he might have tried here, I guess, is rook to b3. How would I have had to respond to this? Yeah, something like rook c1 would probably be just a winning endgame for black. Takes, and takes here. Maybe not knight f5. I probably don't want to trade those. Maybe I can get away with taking this with check. I'm going to say I can get away with taking this with check. And after king g3, I'll play this g5 move. And yeah, I mean, you can take, I can take, and it's just 2 extra pawns for black. So yeah, rook b3 would have traded into this losing endgame, which was maybe a try for white. Instead, we see king h2, trying to keep the game going. I simply play rook to c1, you know, bringing in my pieces. On the side, I have more space on this side. My pieces have more options. and my opponent has more weaknesses, which is why black is winning this game. So we see queen to a4.
Can't he take the pawn on h5?
Yeah, that's a good question, actually. I forgot to mention that. So yeah, queen h5 is legal, but it runs into some serious problems. What would black play here, maybe? Queen b1 wasn't at the top of my list, but it might be good enough. It might be maybe best, actually. The move I was thinking of was simply queen to d4. With the same idea, you just threaten a checkmate. The most natural move is knight to f3 to stop it, and now queen to f4. And this rook is pinned. This queen is actually trapped. And yeah, there's really nothing for white to do here besides queen g4. And let's see, maybe best is.
Oh, what's the difference? Why can't he go to g5?
Okay, sure, he can go to g5.
I figured threaten the knight.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And it's also pinning the queen to the rook.
Yeah, maybe I'll just take.
Well, it forces the take almost.
And yeah, this endgame would also be winning. It feels like black should have better. Maybe you're right with this queen b1 move, actually. Defending this, threatening this, and I don't think there's actually a way for white to white to break through. He has to spend a move saving his queen, and he also has to spend a move stopping checkmate, and you really can't do both. So yeah, that's why queen h5 isn't good. So we see queen a4 instead, trying to get into e8. Black has a few options here. I actually just chose knight to c6, and now we actually saw knight takes g6. White decided, okay, I have to do something here. Unfortunately for him, knight g6 isn't working at all, but you know, it was an attempt. I captured, he captured. I attack his rook. He takes my pawn. And now I get a very interesting choice that I don't get very often in my games. I had to choose between winning his queen or checkmating his king, which it's a pleasant choice to have. But what are kind of, you know, the main two options for black here? What do you think? Yeah.
Looking at where your checkmate idea was.
So b5 is actually just, you know, checkmate on the queen, but checkmate on the king is a little bit less straightforward.
I played b5.
You would play b5? That's fair. Going all the way back to the first Road to 2000 class, using this idea that I showed in a mating net puzzle.
Looking at h4.
Yeah, h4 is exactly right. That's what I played in the game. Nope, I played queen f2 in the game, and then I played h4.
Well, I felt like h4
But,
was too early for that because you needed to get something else to trap it first.
Yeah, I don't know. h4 immediately is probably just fine. Might be even better. But yeah, I don't know. I played queen f2 first. I'm sure it's fine. Queen f2 actually comes with the threat of checkmate, which is why you played rook f6, and now I played h4. Again with the threat of checkmate, and the king is just stuck here. There's nothing white can do. He checked me, I moved, and then he resigned. There's simply no way to stop both of these threats. So yeah, it kind of all went wrong very quickly for white. You know, at 1 second it seemed like, okay, maybe white doesn't have a plan, but you know, it's not like he's losing. And then the next second, you know, black was completely breaking through on the queen's side. So it's important to be cautious when you don't have a plan in situations like this, because you really do have to pay very close attention. And the key moment, I really do think, is way back here on this knight g3 move, right? White should have realized, okay, I mean, this move doesn't advance my plan. All it does is trade off a piece. Maybe it's trading off an inactive piece for an active one, and that's, you know, a positive benefit for me. But much better would be to simply play something like b4 and, you know, challenge this file, in my opinion. But even after this, it's not too late. The key moment number 2, I think, is this rook d1 move, when you really have to play something like rook to c1. You can even bring the a rook to c1, but I think the f rook makes more sense. And this would just be, you know, a lot better way for white to try to contest this game, is to play rook to c1. So this game is going to be Igor Glek against Thomas Luther, which, it's a 25-50 playing a 24-60. So, kind of a low-level Grandmaster game. Low level. But let's see how things went wrong for Black in this game and the key differences we might find. So last game, White kind of played, kind of aimlessly, right? He made some weaknesses, and then he found all of a sudden, I can't get my plan through. What do? I'll just trade pieces. So here, White plays, very clearly with very distinct ideas, which is the real difference in, chess strategy. So e4, c6, we see the same opening. Knight f3, bishop e2. Note that this player chose to keep the bishops on the board, giving him these ideas of, g4 with tempo. c5, attacking the pawn. White actually has a few options here. The main variation in this opening now actually goes with bishop e3, which, Black also has a couple options. The line I play is takes, knight e7. And this is actually a huge difference in structure, though. This is no longer a closed center opening. This might be something you call a semi-open center, or a fluid center is something I've heard. And so because of that, the plans are going to be completely different here, which is why I don't want to talk too much about this. I just want to briefly mention that these openings can go in a couple different directions. So here the plans are going to be totally different because the center can open up. So White's going to be playing things like c4 eventually. He's going to try to be attacking the White king right away, making use of this square possibly. And things are just going to be totally different. But the line that White chose in this game goes with castles, knight c6, and c3, maintaining the closed center structure. So we see takes, knight e7, a3, bishop e4, knight c3, bishop takes f3, bishop takes f3. So Black tried to get this awkward bishop out of the way early on. It's kind of not the most common idea in this specific line, but it's certainly been played before. We see knight f5, so White's putting pressure on this d pawn, just trying to develop his pieces and get counterplay where he has more space. We see bishop e3, bishop e7, and now White makes a very, very interesting move. What are some ideas you can think of for White here? Obviously, in general, we still have this long-term plan of trying to get this f-pawn through with this g-pawn, but it's looking like that might not be so easy to achieve right away. So one way to go about thinking about this is to think, okay, what's the big problem right now? Why can't I just play something like g4? What's the issue? Maybe not so much knight takes e3 being an issue, but knight h4 is a huge issue, right? It's attacking your bishop has to move again. And now there's always this h5 idea that can be annoying, right? So because of that, White decided, so what can I do to remove this knight and start pushing my pawns? So now that you've gone through this line of thinking, what's my plan? All right, why can't I achieve my plan? What can I do to achieve it? You want to remove the knight, so how can you get rid of this knight?
You can take it eventually.
Well, okay, but how does this translate to specific moves? How can you take this knight? How can you remove this knight from its square?
Bishop g4?
Exactly right, bishop g4. White plays very simply here. He says, okay, I want to move this f-pawn to f5. I want to, play g4. This knight is in my way, so I'm going to attack it. And, Black certainly doesn't want to allow this change of structure. This just creates a lot of weaknesses for Black. This h7 pawn is weak. This f7 pawn is also weak now as well as all of these dark squares. So this kind of forces Black to go for this change of structure with knight takes e3 and f takes e3. And already, White has kind of achieved his pawn break in a sense, right? He didn't get to play f5, but he did get to open up the position, which is the whole goal of the pawn break. He's opened up the position for his pieces where he has more space. So let's see how the game continued. Continued with castles, rook f2. White prepares, maybe a couple different ways of doubling on the f-file. It also just protects this weak pawn. We see bishop h4. So this provokes White to play g3. I'm not so sure that this is a great move from Black, but it makes some sense. Bishop g5, attacking maybe a weakness. But again, I think it would make a lot more sense for black to just be playing, instead of all this, to start going for these ideas on the queen side with, moving this queen, playing a6, b5, maybe putting a rook on the c file. I think this would have made more sense for black. Instead, he goes in for this kind of strange-looking bishop maneuver. White develops his queen, always eyeing the side where he has more space, always eyeing, opening up the position further where he has more space. We see queen b6, simply king to g2, just improves the king. Queen a6. So black was actually just kind of afraid of the kingside attack, so he plays this kind of weird line to try to trade off these queens. Something we might have seen instead of queen b6 is this a6 move. This might have been more in line with thinking, okay, I don't care about the king side, I'm going to play on the queen side. But already, since he's wasted some time with this bishop and allowed this f file to open up, he's going to run into some trouble with the queens on the board. So something might just happen like rook e1, b5, h4, and maybe as soon as this knight leaves the d4 square, white opens it up further. And you really don't want the queens on the board for positions like this, because black's queen isn't doing anything, and white's queen is doing quite a lot. So maybe because of lines like these, black decided, all right, I'm just going to bite the bullet and spend 2 moves to trade the queens. So we see queen a6. White goes ahead and takes because it hurts black's structure. Takes, rook to e1, supporting this weak pawn. Knight a5, and I'm going to say this is a mistake. So why is knight a5 maybe not the best move? Because it's kind of following these plans we talked about, right? It's trying to improve his piece, but it's leaving something behind that's actually very important. And it all has to do with preventing white's plan and furthering your own plan.
H4.
Yeah, so that's exactly right. You can even start with h4 if you want, but the main idea I want to look at is this e4 move, right? White would like to play e4, so he can get his knight into, better squares. And so that's actually why this knight move is a mistake. So with this knight on c6, it's a bit harder to play e4, right? If black plays something useful, like rook to b8, then e4 isn't coming right away, because this pawn is hanging. So yeah, I would have liked to see rook to b8 from black. I think this would have been a much better line. But now, like you said, white can actually just continue to gain more space. So I think white maintains an edge with something like this. But yeah, instead knight a5, and white can actually just break through right away. So we see knight to c4 instead, as a response. White goes ahead and takes on d5. Black tries to regain the pawn with this check, king h3, and takes. And now what do you think white did? He kind of opened things up for himself, but you shouldn't be afraid to trade one advantage for another. So he did something kind of, not quite in line with the plan, but certainly giving himself a decent edge for the game.
You take the knight.
Yeah. Why do you want to take the knight?
If you take the knight and it takes back, allows you to push the e-pawn.
Okay, so that's one idea, is pushing the e-pawn there. But the other main idea that I wanted to show is, it saddles black with the weakness, right?
And it's isolated pawn.
Yeah. So you take the knight, and the point is this pawn is going to be weak forever. You have a light squared bishop, he has a dark squared bishop, so it's very easy to attack this pawn. You're getting on the c file first as well, and it's going to be very difficult for black to hold this all together. So this is what we saw in the game. Bishop f3, attacking this pawn, rook to d8, and now white's on the c file, white's attacking the weaknesses. It's very, very pleasant. Rook to c8, so black actually gives up this d5 pawn right away rather than let the rook in. So takes, takes. Black tries this move, rook to d8, trying to regain the pawn. We see bishop a2, takes, rook f1. So black gets this pawn back, but unfortunately he's not going to keep it for very long because f7 is also weak. Thanks to the open f file. It all comes back to opening it up where you have more space. We see h6, rook f7. Then I'll play through this rather quickly because black's just losing here. Plays rook d2. White goes ahead and pushes with e6. Now just tactically, white wins via this e7 move. And what's the idea, do you think? Why doesn't black just play bishop e7 and take the pawn for free?
Play what?
So yeah, so why does this move work tactically? Because at first glance, it looks like, you know, bishop takes e7, rook takes e7, rook takes c4 is okay for black. Right, rook takes c4. But, you know, white might have some idea here. So how would you meet bishop takes e7, just as a little tactical finish?
Oh, yeah, there's bishop to e6.
Yeah, bishop e6 is the move. So the problem right now with taking is it's discovered attack, it's a check, but, you know, black can take. So the idea is you want to make it when you take this bishop, your bishop is defended, which is how you come to this bishop e6 move. Now, you know, if rook to c7, this check works. Black has to get out of check before recapturing, so he loses. And if he tries to attack the bishop again, now rook e7 is actually defending our piece.
I guess I said the king to attack the rook, and you might just get some repetitive stuff.
Yeah, king f8 doesn't quite work because we can come back to f7, and if rook e8 here, we can come to c4, I think. And we'll untangle our pieces. So yeah, that's how the game ended, actually. Black took here, white played bishop e6, and then black resigned. So I went through that game a lot more quickly. But any questions about how black ended up worse and then how black ended up losing? No? I kind of want to go back to one or two key moments. So I think, you know, this bishop h4, bishop g5 stuff, I think this didn't really help black's plan at all. So I think these were kind of wasted tempi. And then second of all, this knight a5 move really isn't helping him at all. He should have realized, you know, this e4 move is a very serious idea. This is what white wants in the position. So he should have done as much as he can to stop it. And rook to b8, I think, puts up a lot more resistance. Because it's not so easy to push e4 with this weak d pawn. And now I think white actually has to switch ideas and start, you know, playing over here with moves like bishop f3 and g4, g5. And yeah, so I think, you know, this is where black really started going wrong, is, you know, playing around with his bishop on the king's side when, you know, there's really no ideas there, and then not noticing that he needs to stop e4. Whereas if you look at the white pieces, every move he played had a very clear purpose, right? You know, all the way going back to this bishop g4 move, it's saying, okay, take on e3 and open up the position, or else I'm going to take your knight and I'm going to roll through with my pawns now. It's really forcing the issue and opening it up where you have more space, which in the end is always going to be the idea. So with that, you know, I did promise to take a quick look at the French tirage. So I just want to briefly introduce another way of approaching these positions, which shows up sometimes. So it's the same pawn structure. We see this c5, this c3, knight c6, knight e2, takes. This is the French tirage. And now, you know, instead of trying to play on the queen's side so much, black actually ends up going for a different idea. So I'm sure you guys have seen it before, but what do you think it is?
F6.
Yeah, so you go for this f6 move. So previously we've been playing where we've had more space attacking the base of the pawn chain. And the idea here is to attack the head of the pawn chain. And again, this ends up going for a kind of a huge change of structure after e takes f, which is by far the main move, knight takes f. And again, instead of one of these closed centers, the center would become fluid again, and black would be trying to open it up in the center. And so the plans here would be totally different, which is why I don't want to spend too much time talking about it in a closed center kind of lecture, but it is worth mentioning. So any questions about either game, about this structure in general, about you know, the plans in these positions? All right, with that in mind, I just want to briefly recap. The idea in closed positions like these are always, or usually, play on the side where you have more space, look for pawn breaks to open the position, and, you know, play every move with this purpose or with the purpose of slowing down your opponent. Those are the three big ideas I wanted to get across today. With that in mind, thank you guys for hanging out. Thank you YouTube viewers for watching. This has been The Road to 2000. Be sure to join me next week.